Alabama, 1856, Pine Hollow Plantation. The fairground lay swollen with noise, as if all the dust roads of Dallas County had emptied their souls into Selma. The air carried the clash of fiddles, the bark of auctioneers, the sour sting of whiskey, and the rank perfume of sweat that clung to wool coats and cotton dresses alike. Flags whipped against poles, horses stamped, and vendors shouted of molasses candy and tobacco leaves. The 4th of July had long passed, but every county fair was its own declaration, a ritual of boasting, selling, judging. Isaac, the blacksmith of Pine Hollow, was ordered there not to wander but to serve. His hands cracked, burned, layered with soot, were summoned to repair the fair's anvil and iron tools. 30 years old, skin dark as forge ash, he was known as the Slow One when it pleased Carter to sneer, though no gate stood secure without his hammer, no shackle held firm without his fire. Henry Carter, master of Pine Hollow, wore white linen that gleamed like arrogance. His cane tapped as he walked, his laughter carried like in-fire. He thrived on spectacle, the crowd's approval more intoxicating than rum. When he saw Isaac standing upright by the anvil, hammer in hand, he paused, then smiled the way a cat smiles at a crippled bird. "On your knees, blacksmith," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "Crawl to your anvil. Show these gentlemen how you work." The words cut the air, and a silence fell before the crowd erupted into jeers and whistles. Some slapped their thighs with glee, others leaned in closer. Carter gestured again, eyes gleaming, a hand raised as though conducting an orchestra of cruelty. Isaac did not move at first. The hammer weighed in his grip, the wood worn to his palm. But then the overseer Pike, a man of red neck and cracked lips, stepped forward with his riding crop. "You heard him," Pike said. "Crawl, dog." The leather snapped across Isaac's shoulders. He staggered, the burn stinging, and then lowered himself. Dust rose around his knees, clung to the sweat on his skin. He crawled the short distance to the anvil while laughter boomed like thunder. A boy threw a peanut shell at him. A woman covered her mouth and giggled as if at a puppet show. "Bow," Pike ordered. "Bow to the iron you love so much. Bow for your master." Isaac bent low, forehead nearly touching the anvil's cold face. His arms shook, not from weakness, but from restraint. He could feel the crowd pressing on his back like 1,000 stones. Somewhere beyond the ring, a fiddler struck up a tune to drown the unease, but the sound only sharpened the laughter. Carter leaned close enough that Isaac smelled the sweet rot of brandy on his breath. "Look at those hands," he said, gripping Isaac's wrist and raising it to the light. The crowd murmured at the sight of the burns, the deep cracks etched into skin. "And still too slow. Tell me, gentlemen, what good is a smith who takes all day to mend a chain?" More laughter. Isaac's jaw tightened. The hammer lay by his knee, inches away, a weight that called to him. But the voice in his skull was older than rage. It said, "Wait." At last Carter released him, and the crowd dispersed toward horse stalls and pie contests. Isaac remained bowed until Pike cuffed the back of his head and muttered, "Up, dog." He rose without a word, without a flicker of his gaze, and returned to his station. But inside, something black and slow was turning, like coals buried under ash waiting for the bellows. That night, Pine Hollow sweltered. The air hung heavy with honeysuckle and manure. Lanterns glowed in the big house where Carter entertained guests with whiskey and fiddles, while the cabins of the enslaved stood in a hush, broken only by coughs and the distant cry of a baby. Isaac walked past the cookhouse, where Ruth sat hunched. She had been hollow since morning. Her infant, her third, was gone, sold without a word to a trader heading south. The cradle lay empty, rocking with no wind. Her hands gripped the wooden spoon as if it were a weapon, though her eyes were dry. Grief had boiled her tears away. Near the smokehouse, John 15, with eyes too sharp for his years, lay chained to the post. His sister had been dragged out that afternoon, screaming as Pike hauled her by the arm. John had hidden her under sacks of cornmeal, but they found her, and for that they shackled him. The iron dug into his ankles, drawing blood, yet his face was set with defiance. Pike stood over him, smiling with rotten teeth. "You'll learn," he said, twirling the key. "Ain't no hiding from iron." Isaac watched from the shadow of the forge. The boy's jaw quivered, not from fear, but fury. Ruth turned away, pressing her hands to her belly. The night deepened, filled with the sound of chains shifting, children whimpering, men sighing as though sleep itself had been sold. Isaac entered the smithy, where embers glowed low. The anvil, blackened and cold, loomed before him. He set down his hammer and stared at the iron scraps scattered in the ash. His body still ached from Pike's crop, his knees raw from the fairground dust. His humiliation clung like soot, yet it was not humiliation alone that fed the fire inside him. It was Ruth's empty arms, John's bleeding ankles, the echo of Carter's laugh. The overseer called him slow. The master mocked his hands, but they never saw what he saw, that every gate, every shackle, every lock passed through him. His touch made their world secure or could undo it. He did not dream of fire and blades, not yet. He dreamed of silence, of vanishing without a trace, of slipping chains like smoke through cracks. Not one, not two, but many children, mothers, brothers, gone all at once. Doors opening where none should. In the darkness, he whispered no prayer. He simply laid his hand flat on the anvil's face. The iron was cool now, but he felt the memory of heat beneath it. He closed his eyes and thought, I will forge something they cannot see. Something that will open what they think closed forever. Outside, a whip cracked in the distance. A woman's voice cried out and fell silent. The plantation held its breath, waiting for dawn. And in the forge, Isaac's silence hardened into steel. The forge was both his prison and his sanctuary. By day, it was the overseer's workshop, a place where Pike barked orders and demanded chains mended before sundown. By night, when the quarters had gone quiet and even Pike's curses were lost in liquor, it became something else. The anvil glowed faintly in moonlight, and the coals, stirred gently, gave just enough heat to soften scraps of iron. Isaac's hammer moved slow, deliberate, never louder than the groan of the bellows. He had begun with a fragment no larger than a child's finger bone. He filed it against the stone, testing, shaping, measuring, with eyes that knew the difference between freedom and capture would rest in the width of a groove no thicker than a hair. The lock on the mule shed had been his practice, rusty, stubborn, forgiving of mistakes. He worked it open again and again until he could do it blindfolded, until the click of its release was quieter than a moth's wing. Every strike of the hammer was hidden beneath his duties. When Pike or Carter came sniffing, he let the hammer ring louder, as though merely reshaping a hoe or tightening a hinge. The secret work was tucked into moments, when Pike turned his back to drink, when the fire popped loud enough to mask the scrape of file against metal, when laughter from the big house spilled down the hill and covered all else. The first true key was for the side gate, the narrow one near the cane fields, seldom used, where the iron teeth had been worn by weather and neglect. He studied it each time Pike sent him to oil the hinges. He bent his head low as if ashamed, but in truth he was memorizing every curve. By the third week, he had a duplicate that slid into the lock and turned smooth as breath. The second was harder, the cabin chains. John's manacle had cut so deep that Isaac could see the exact ridges where the teeth of the lock bit into iron. He sketched the pattern in his mind and carried it into the forge. The file sang softly as he shaped the copy, and when it fit, when it opened on the first try, he nearly wept at the sound of silence where once there had been clatter. The third key was for the tool shed, where axes, ropes, and nails were kept under padlock. Carter guarded it as if its contents were treasure, but Isaac knew tools could be more precious than gold when the night came. That key he worked longest, hiding scraps in the ash pile, letting them cool under the cover of old coals until they looked like nothing more than waste. The last was the bell tower lock. The tower rose at the center of Pine Hollow, a spindly frame of wood with a bronze mouth that summoned or punished, depending on who heard it. Isaac climbed it once under order to grease the gears, and in that moment he studied the lock that sealed its hatch. He knew if the bell were silenced, the night would belong to them, not to Carter. He forged the key for it in secret, testing it only once. The sound of the click, muffled in darkness, was enough to send his heart racing. He oiled the gears with beef fat, And when he lowered the clapper, he wedged a sliver of pine between its tongue and bronze. If someone yanked the rope, it would ring only once, then seize like a throat closed in terror. But keys alone would not be enough. A door might open, yet if feet stumbled, if voices rose, all would be undone. So Isaac began to shape not only iron, but people. Ruth, hollow-eyed from her loss, listened when he spoke in whispers by the cookhouse fire. He told her of rags wrapped around shoes to hide prints, of walking in wagon tracks so the ground told no tale. She nodded slowly, as though sewing the instructions into her very skin. To the children she taught silence games where they held their breath, where the one who stayed quiet longest won a scrap of bread. Mary, whose hands were nimble with thread, hid dried bread in her hem and strips of cloth rolled so thin they looked like folds. If anyone searched her, they would find nothing but a servant's garments. Yet inside was a journey's worth of bandages and crumbs. John, still scarred at the ankles, scratched a map with charcoal on the underside of a barrel lid. He drew the irrigation ditches, the cane fields, the bend of the Cahaba River, where thickets grew so dense a man could disappear 2 feet from his pursuer. He traced the place where logs and barrel lids might serve as rafts. Isaac studied it, committed it to memory, then burned it in the forge, letting the ash mingle with iron filings. Even cover stories were hammered into shape. Isaac deliberately broke a mule's harness one afternoon, feigning clumsiness. Pike cursed him, but Carter, ever eager for excuses to boast, ordered Isaac to stay late in the smithy and repair it. Isaac obeyed with a bow, hiding his satisfaction. Now he had reason to work the forge long after others slept. The preparations wove into daily life like invisible thread. Ruth continued cooking, Mary mending, John chopping wood. Isaac hammered tools and shod mules. To Pike and Carter, nothing had changed, but beneath the skin of Pine Hollow, a new rhythm pulsed. Silent, patient, inexorable. Some nights Isaac lay awake on the dirt floor of his cabin, the keys tucked in a leather scrap beneath the hearthstone. He touched the pouch, feeling each shape like rosary beads. His body longed for rest, but his mind counted. One for the gate, one for the chains, one for the shed, one for the bell. Each was a promise forged in fire, a path toward vanishing. The danger was constant. Once Pike stumbled into the forge drunk, demanding horseshoes in the middle of the night. Isaac froze, hammer in hand, the half-filed blank hidden in the ash. Pike swayed, cursed, and collapsed against the doorframe. Isaac's breath did not return until the man snored himself back out into the night. Another time, Carter himself inspected the shed and frowned at the lock as though suspecting tampering. Isaac stood nearby, hammer poised, heart slamming. Carter jiggled it, muttered about rust, then called for oil. Isaac supplied it with steady hands, though his palms sweated rivers. Only when Carter walked away did Isaac allow himself the smallest exhale. Through it all, he spoke little. Silence had become his shield, his ally. In silence, he worked the iron. In silence, he plotted routes. In silence, he taught others to still their breath until even the night birds seemed louder. And yet there were moments when the weight pressed hard, Ruth whispering the baby's name into her empty arms, John staring at the shackles still raw against his skin, children asking why the stars looked like cracks in the sky. Isaac could not answer them. He only pressed harder against the keys in his pouch, feeling their cold promise. The forge fire hissed, the hammer fell, and in every spark Isaac saw not chains, but doors. Doors that one night soon would open. Humiliation was no stranger to Isaac, but in that autumn it reached new shapes, sharper than iron teeth. The fairground crawling had been spectacle enough, yet Henry Carter had a son eager to prove cruelty could be refined like whiskey distilled and poured into every day. Thomas was 20, reckless and cruel in the way only the young rich can be, certain the world was made for their pleasure. He lingered near the forge, pretending to marvel at Isaac's work, though in truth he sought only ways to wound. One afternoon he strode in, holding a kettle of water meant for boiling tack clean. "You work too slow," Thomas said, voice oiled with contempt. "Let's see if you move quicker when the iron bites first." Before Isaac could step back, the kettle tipped. Boiling water splashed across his wrist and forearm, searing flesh, raising blisters that screamed. Isaac bit his tongue until blood filled his mouth. Around them, field hands paused in horror. But Thomas only laughed, tossing the empty kettle aside. "Look how he dances," he crowed, imitating Isaac's instinctive recoil. "A fine jig, isn't it, Pike?" The overseer joined the laughter, slapping his thigh. "Should boil the rest of him," Pike jeered. "Might get a day's work done on time." Isaac cradled his arm, the skin throbbing, the smell of cooked flesh rising like some obscene incense. He said nothing. To speak would be to break, and silence, though heavy, was the only armor left. That night, while others slept, he bound the burn in rags dipped in cool ditch water. He flexed his fingers, testing whether the tendons still obeyed. They did barely. Enough to grip hammer, enough to file metal. Pain was nothing new, it merely added fuel to the slow fire of his resolve. Days later, Pike found another game. He entered the forge at dusk, chains rattling in his hand. "Test of strength," he said, grinning. "Let's see how these fit the smith." Before Isaac could resist, Pike clamped the shackles around his ankle. The cold bite of iron was familiar, yet this was worse. It was mockery, the overseer twirling the key like a trinket, dangling it before Isaac's eyes. "Strong as steel," Pike said, locking and unlocking the cuff. "Maybe we'll keep you this way, dog at the forge." The men nearby laughed. Isaac kept his head bowed, memorizing. He watched the grooves, the notches, the slight wear at the teeth. Every rotation of that key carved itself into his mind. Pike thought he was displaying mastery. In truth, he was handing Isaac the very pattern of escape. When the overseer left, still chuckling, Isaac bent to the lock and felt its edges. By midnight, he had already begun filing a copy, testing it against an old broken clasp until the sound of the click was indistinguishable from silence. The overseer's insult had given him the last tool he needed. The season turned toward winter. The fields withered, but the big house prepared for its own harvest. The annual barn dance. Neighbors would gather, fiddles shrieking, liquor flowing, overseers boasting of cotton and coin. It was a night of spectacle for the carters, but for Isaac it was the curtain before flight. Preparations became sharper, like final strokes on a blade. He greased hinges with beef fat until doors moved like whispers. He tested the gate key in darkness, ensuring it turned without scrape. He wrapped the bell clapper in its pine wedge, then yanked the rope once, a single muffled chime, then silence absolute. Ruth played her part. In the cookhouse, she brewed cider richer than usual, stronger, sweetened to mask the sharpness of corn liquor. When Pike came sniffing, she offered it with a smile carved from ash. He drank deep, praising her skull. By the second cup, his swagger slowed, words slurring, hands fumbling. His eyes narrowed suspiciously at nothing, then dulled into half-drunk vacancy. Mary finished stitching her hem pockets, smoothing them as though they were nothing more than careful sewing. Inside lay strips of cloth, dried bread, a flint tucked small as a pebble. If searched, no one would think twice housewomen were always mending, always tucking. John sharpened his map with finger traces in dirt near the quarters, showing children the ditch that wound past the fields, the cane thickets that swallowed sound, the curve of the Cahaba where water grew black under moonlight. "Step where I step," he whispered. "Don't break the line. Don't speak. Even if the dogs howl, don't speak." Isaac watched, silent as always, yet within him the storm gathered. Each humiliation, each cruelty had been fuel. Now it burned steady, forging his silence into action. On the eve of the barn dance, Pine Hollow glittered with lanterns. Wagons rattled up the long road, guests descending in silks and boots. Fiddlers tuned, dogs barked, whiskey sloshed. The big house roared with laughter. In the forge, Isaac worked as ordered, repairing a hinge, hammering slow. His burned wrist ached, the scarred skin stiff, but he pressed on. Beneath the hearthstone, the pouch of keys waited, each edge sharp, each tooth perfect. He touched them once, as a priest might touch relics. Outside, Pike stumbled already half-drunk from Ruth's cider, cursing at shadows. Carter strutted, boasting of cotton yields. No one looked toward the smithy, no one noticed Isaac's steady gaze. The night approached like thunder building unseen. Soon the dance would swell, the liquor spill, the laughter grow loud enough to drown any sound. That was when the hammer would strike thrice, the signal. That was when locks would fall silent and doors would open. But for now, Isaac waited in his forge, the coals glowing red, the keys cooling in their pouch. He closed his fist, and for the first time in years, the silence inside him felt not like chains, but like wings. The night came thick with frost, a silver haze laid across the cane fields. Lanterns still burned in the big house, where Carter's guests stomped and laughed, fiddles shrieked, and boots rattled the barn floor. Whiskey sloshed, voices rose, laughter echoed into the darkness like thunder rolling from a storm that never saw the fields. In the forge, Isaac stood alone. His hammer rested cold against the anvil. His burned wrist ached, but his hand was steady. He listened not to the music spilling from the barn, not to Pike's curses weaving drunk through the air, but to the silence between. Silence that carried more than sound, it carried waiting. He lifted the hammer and struck, once, twice, thrice. Dull blows, heavy but muted, timed with the beat of a fiddle. The signal. From the cabins, shadows stirred. Ruth rose first, guiding the smallest children. Mary pressed her hem, checking the hidden bread and cloth. John flexed his scarred ankles, chains glinting faint in the moonlight. One by one they began to move, not yet free, but moving toward it. Isaac knelt by John's fetters. The boy's breath steamed in the cold as the key slid in. A soft click, a silence sharper than thunder. The iron fell away. John's eyes flared, but he said nothing. He stood, light on his feet, as if the ground itself had changed. The children came next. 2 girls, 3 boys' shackles loose enough to slip with Isaac's touch. He worked quickly, his hands memorized to each lock's rhythm. The final key freed the side gate. Hinges groaned, but the fat had done its work. The sound was swallowed. The gate swung open like a mouth reluctant yet obedient. "Go," Isaac whispered, his first word in weeks, maybe months. The children filed out, Ruth pressing them forward. Shoes wrapped in rags muffled their steps. The earth held its breath as their line snaked into the dark. From the tower above, the bell rope hung like a serpent. A hand yanked it once. The bronze tongue struck one thin chime, hollow as bone. Then silence. The pine wedge held firm. No alarm, no clamor. The overseer's sentinel was gagged. In the kennels, dogs stirred, sniffing, but their bellies were heavy with salted pork. Ruth had slipped them at dusk. They whined, shifted, then lay down again, muzzles between paws. A growl began, but softened into whimper. Even the beasts had been brought to silence. Pike stumbled across the yard, bottle in hand. "Who's there?" he barked, eyes glazed. He tripped on a bucket, cursed, spat into the dirt. The cider still sang in his blood, blurring his sight. He fumbled for a torch but dropped it, sputtering sparks into mud. By the time he looked up, the shadows had already slipped past. The side gate creaked once, then closed behind them. Beyond it, fields stretched flat and pale under moonlight. Isaac led them into the irrigation ditch, water shallow but dark, its banks high enough to cloak their movement. Cane rustled overhead, whispering as though the earth itself urged them onward. Ruth carried the smallest child. Mary kept the line tight, whispering to those who faltered. John walked rear guard, eyes wide, jaw clenched. Isaac moved at the front, keys jangling softly in his pouch, a sound no one else could hear, a sound meant only for him. They reached the thickets by the kahaba. Tall cane closed around them, thick as a wall, sharp leaves slicing at bare skin. They pushed through, bodies bruised, but no cry escaped. The river lay before them, black and wide, its surface trembling with moonlight. There were no boats, only what they had built. Barrel lids lashed with rope, poles stripped from branches, scraps of planks stolen one by one, makeshift rafts, fragile as promises. Yet promises were all they had. The first raft slid into water. It bobbed, nearly overturned, then steadied under weight. Children clung, Ruth at their center, arms around them like the last shield she had to give. Mary pushed off next, whispering prayers no one could hear. John leapt to his place, pole gripped tight. Isaac stood last on the bank. He looked once behind. Pine Hollow glowing on the hill, lanterns swaying, fiddles screeching, Carter's voice rising above the din. The world of chains, of laughter at wounds, of empty cradles. Then he looked forward, at the black river cut with silver. He stepped onto the final raft. It rocked, steadied, poles dug into mud, pushed. The water swallowed them, carried them away. Behind, Pine Hollow shrank to a smear of light. Before, the river stretched endless. The current tugged, slow but strong. Children shivered under cloth. Ruth held them close. Isaac braced against the pole, burned wrist throbbing, but he did not stop. Every push carried them further from iron, further from Carter, further from Pike's drunken snarl. Midstream, the current swirled. One raft tilted, nearly capsizing. Cries rose, stifled quick. Isaac reached, gripping rope, steadying. His hand bled where fibers bit, but he pulled until the raft straightened. Silence returned, broken only by the lap of water. Moonlight silvered their faces. Fear gleamed, but so did something else. Something Isaac had not seen before. Hope, fragile as glass, yet burning hotter than any forge. Dawn's first light broke as they reached the far bank. The rafts lodged in mud, scraping against roots. One by one, they stepped onto soil wet and cold. Their rags hung heavy, their limbs shook. But they stood free of the water, free of the hill, free of the Carter house that still roared in ignorance. Isaac knelt. From his pouch he pulled the keys, 4 in all, gate, chains, shed, bell. He looked at them a final time, each tooth gleaming with memory. Then he snapped them, one by one, against stone. The shards he scattered into bogs and thickets, each fragment swallowed by mud. No master would use them. No pursuer would follow their shape. The children gathered around Ruth. John stared back across the river, jaw tight, eyes wet. Mary touched her hem, ensuring the bread still remained. Isaac straightened, his arm scarred, his hand empty. They vanished into cane and pine. Behind them, Pine Hollow slept on, still dancing, still laughing, still blind. Before them lay miles of swamp, patrols, hunger, frost. But also something larger, heavier, truer, the taste of breath not owned by another. The river closed behind them. The night kept their secret. And Isaac walked at the front, no chains on his ankle, no bow in his spine, leading 14 souls into a dawn the Carters could never imagine. By the time the sun rose fully over Pine Hollow, the Carters still danced, ignorant. The fiddles had played past midnight, Pike had collapsed in the yard, and Carter himself bragged drunkenly of cotton prices. None yet knew what the river had swallowed. The discovery came at dawn when the bell failed to ring. A farmhand tugged the rope-only silence. By mid-morning, the side gate stood ajar, the tool shed lock scraped, chains missing from John's post. Panic spread like fire. Carter raged. He stormed through cabins, overturned pallets, whipped men who knew nothing. He shouted of ingratitude, of betrayal. 14 gone, he said, 14 souls stolen in the night by one blacksmith's treachery. By week's end, the Montgomery Advertiser printed the headline, "The Keysmith's Treason, Slave Blacksmith Engineer's Mass Escape." The article dripped with fury. It called for harsher patrols, stricter laws, heavier chains. It warned planters that the very hands that forge your locks may fashion their undoing. Some editors claimed it was madness, others insisted it was witchcraft. But among the quarters, the story spread differently. In whispers over cookfires, in songs hummed low, Isaac became more than a man. They said he held the shape of freedom in his hands, that he turned chains into doors. Mothers whispered his name to children. Where Isaac forges, doors open. Field hands passed the phrase like a password, as if invoking it might loosen iron. Carter's world unraveled. He sold off land to cover losses, muttering of conspiracies. Pike drank himself to ruin, mocked as the overseer who slept while 14 vanished. The Carters' neighbors tightened discipline, but fear gnawed at them. Every smithy now looked like a battlefield, every cookfire a council. As for Isaac, he and his group slipped northward through swamps, guided by maps carved in memory. Weeks later, they reached a Baptist safe house across the Tennessee line. From there, rumor claimed, they followed hidden roads, aided by strangers who needed only the name Isaac to open barns, cellars, and church basements. No paper recorded him after, no patrol ever dragged him back. But his absence became his presence. The Carters had lost not only their slaves, but their certainty. And across the South, a whisper ran like current. The keysmith walked free.